The stars above Proxima Station had never seemed so cold or distant as they did on the day the Vraxian fleet arrived. Commander Sarah Chun stood in the observation deck and watched the massive warships slide into formation around humanity's outermost colony. Each vessel dwarfed the largest human battleship by a factor of 10, and there were hundreds of them. Their hulls gleamed with an eerie blue-white luminescence that spoke of technology far beyond what humanity had achieved in its brief 2 centuries of spaceflight. The station's comm systems crackled to life without any request for permission to transmit. That alone told Sarah everything she needed to know about how this first contact would proceed. The face that appeared on every screen throughout the station was angular and proud, with sharp features that reminded her of a bird of prey. 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on its face glowed with an amber light, and its skin had the texture of polished stone. "Attention, human settlement." The alien's voice boomed through the speakers with a translation matrix that made the words sound hollow and mechanical. "I am General Kelther of the Vraxian Imperial Fleet and Conqueror of the 17 Fallen Worlds. Your species has been evaluated and found suitable for integration into the Vraxian Empire. You will transmit your surrender within 1 standard cycle or phase." Immediate military action. Sarah had expected many things from humanity's first contact with alien life, but she had not expected such casual arrogance. Around her, the station's personnel stood frozen in shock and fear. Some of them had families here, and others had left loved ones back on Earth or the Belt colonies. All of them now faced the very real possibility that humanity's expansion into the stars would end before it had truly begun. Continued transmission. Calthera's image seemed to look directly at each viewer simultaneously, which was probably some trick of their display technology. The Vraxian Empire has stood for 12,000 of your years and has brought order to this entire spiral arm of the galaxy. Resistance is not merely futile, but offensive to the natural hierarchy of species. Your primitive weapons and fragile ships cannot stand against our might. You will kneel or you will be made to kneel. The choice is yours, but the outcome is certain. The transmission ended as abruptly as it had begun and left the observation deck in stunned silence. Station Director Marcus Webb turned to Sarah with desperation in his eyes. "Commander Chun, you have to do something. You're the only military officer we have up here, and Earth Command won't be able to send reinforcements for weeks, even if they left today." Sarah continued staring at the Vraxian fleet, and her mind already raced through tactical assessments and strategic considerations. She had spent 15 years in the Earth Defense Force before transferring to the diplomatic corps, and every instinct she had developed during those years now screamed warnings at her. "They're waiting for us to respond," she said quietly. "That ultimatum wasn't really a negotiation attempt. It was a dominance display. They want us to panic and beg and show weakness. Then what do we do?" Marcus asked. Sarah turned away from the window and met his gaze with steady determination. "We send them a negotiator, someone who can buy us time while Earth prepares whatever response they can muster. Someone who won't give them the satisfaction of seeing humans grovel." "You mean yourself," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. "I mean myself." 2 hours later, Sarah stood alone in a transport shuttle that approached the largest of the Vraxian warships. She wore her old EDF dress uniform because she wanted these aliens to understand that humanity had warriors too, even if their weapons were primitive by Vraxian standards. The uniform was black with silver trim and bore the medals she had earned during the Belt skirmishes, when human factions had fought over asteroid mining rights. The Vraxian vessel swallowed her shuttle like a whale consuming plankton, and she found herself in a landing bay that could have held a dozen ships her size. Gravity plating pulled at her as soon as she stepped down and told her these aliens had mastered technologies that humanity still struggled to develop. A squad of Vraxian soldiers waited for her, and each stood nearly 3 meters tall in armor that hummed with barely contained energy. They led her through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate with their vast scale and harsh lighting until finally she entered what could only be a command chamber. General Calther sat on an elevated platform that forced her to look up at him, and his four eyes studied her with an expression that mixed curiosity with contempt. So the humans send a single female as their representative. Calther's voice no longer needed translation matrices at this range, and Sarah could hear the natural harmonics in his speech. Is this meant as an insult, or do your people truly not understand the gravity of their situation? Sarah walked forward until she stood at the base of his platform and refused to crane her neck upward to meet his gaze. Instead, she looked at the other Vraxian officers who lined the chamber walls and made sure each of them saw her face. General Calther, she began, and kept her voice level and professional. I am Commander Sarah Chun of the Earth Defense Force, an authorized representative of the United Human Council. I have come to discuss the terms you have proposed. There are no terms to discuss, Calther interrupted. There is only the reality of your submission. You are here to formalize your surrender so that we may avoid unnecessary destruction of resources. Your species will be absorbed into the Empire and assigned roles suitable to your capabilities. This is how it has always been done, and how it will be done with humanity. I see, Sarah said. Then you won't mind if I kneel right now and save us both some time? The chamber fell silent, and Calther leaned forward with confusion evident in the way his four eyes focused on her. You would surrender so easily? He asked. Sarah smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I didn't say I would kneel, General. I simply asked if you would mind. But since we're on the subject of kneeling, I have a counter-proposal. The conquered do not make proposals, Calther growled. Then it's fortunate we haven't been conquered yet, Sarah replied. Here is what I propose. Before anyone kneels, you should probably understand what you're demanding. You want humanity to submit, but I don't think you actually know what that means. You don't know who we are, or what we've survived, or why your threat. Doesn't frighten us the way you think it should, Calther. Officers shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah caught the movement in her peripheral vision. Good. Let them wonder. You have one cycle to accept reality, human, Calther said. Spend it how you wish. When the time expires, you will kneel or you will die. There is no third option. Sarah met his four-eyed gaze with her two eyes, and in that moment, something passed between them that neither fully understood. It was the first crack in his certainty, though he didn't recognize it yet. One cycle, then, she agreed. But General, before this is over, one of us will indeed kneel. I just don't think it will be the one you expect. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time in his long career of conquest, General Calther felt something he had not experienced in decades: doubt. The negotiation chamber that General Calther assigned for their formal discussions was clearly meant to intimidate. The ceiling soared 15 meters above the floor, and the walls were decorated with holographic displays showing the Vraxian Empire's conquests. 17 different species stared out from those displays, and each wore expressions of defeat and submission. Sarah Chun walked into the chamber with a data tablet under her arm and seemed completely unaffected by the psychological warfare built into the room's design. She had requested this meeting, and Calther had granted it mostly out of curiosity about what this strange human thought she could accomplish. You wish to present information, Calther said, as he took his position on another elevated platform. I assume this is your surrender document? Not exactly, Sarah replied as she activated her tablet and linked it to the chamber's display systems. The Vraxian officer who managed the technical aspects of the room looked to Calther for approval and received a dismissive gesture. What harm could one human's presentation do? The displays flickered and then showed an image of Earth as seen from space. The blue and green world turned slowly, and Sarah let the image speak for itself for a long moment. This is humanity's homeworld, she began. We call it Earth, and it's the only planet in the known universe where our species evolved. For most of our history, we never left its surface. We didn't even know other worlds existed beyond points of light in our night sky. Primitives, one of Calthur's officers muttered. Sarah ignored the comment and changed the display to show ancient human warfare. Soldiers with bronze spears clashed against each other in formations that seemed absurdly simple compared to modern military doctrine. We've been fighting wars for as long as we've had recorded history, she continued. These early conflicts were brutal and personal. Men fought with metal and muscle and died in their thousands over territory and resources and ideas. The thing you need to understand, General, is that we've never had anyone else to fight but ourselves. Calthur shifted on his platform, and his four eyes tracked, changing images with growing interest despite himself. The display now showed medieval warfare, with castles under siege and armies clashing with swords and arrows. Then it progressed through the centuries, showing muskets and cannons and eventually the mechanized slaughter of the First and Second World Wars. By the time we developed industrial technology, Sarah said, and her voice remained steady even as images of trench warfare and atomic explosions filled the screens. We had become very efficient at killing each other. We invented weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. We created diseases designed specifically to kill, and we developed strategies for total war where civilian populations became legitimate targets. The Vraxian officers were no longer looking bored. Several leaned forward to study the tactical deployments shown in the historical footage, and Sarah saw recognition in their postures. These were warriors, and they understood warfare when they saw it. We nearly destroyed ourselves several times, Sarah continued as the display showed the mushroom clouds of nuclear testing. We built enough weapons to sterilize our planet 100 times over, and we came within minutes of actually using them. Not because we were invaded or threatened by outside forces, but because we couldn't agree on how to organize our own societies. Madness, Calder said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Perhaps, Sarah agreed. But we survived. We always survive, General. That's what I need you to understand. When we faced extinction from our own weapons, we didn't surrender to the threat. We didn't accept that our species had to die. We found ways to step back from the brink, and we kept going. The display changed to show humanity's expansion into space, and Sarah's narration became almost conversational. When we finally left Earth, we didn't do it because we had achieved peace. We did it because we needed resources and territory for our growing population. We fought wars on the Moon and Mars and in the asteroid belt. Small conflicts by galactic standards. Unsure, but they taught us how to fight in environments that would kill us in seconds without our protective suits. She pulled up footage from the belt skirmishes, and Kelthur watched as human soldiers, empowered armor, fought desperate battles in the vacuum of space. They used tactics that seemed reckless, boarding enemy ships through breaches in the hull and fighting in zero gravity with weapons that could puncture their own suits as easily as enemy armor. Your species fights without regard for self-preservation, one of the Vraxian officers observed. We fight with complete awareness of mortality, Sarah corrected. Every human knows they will die. It's built into our psychology and our culture. We accept death as inevitable, which means we don't fear it the way perhaps other species might. What we fear is dying without purpose or living under conditions we find unacceptable. The display now showed the construction of the great colony ships and humanity's push outward to the stars, beyond Sol System. We've been exploring space for less than 200 years, Sarah said. In that time, we've established colonies on 40 worlds and sent expedition fleets to 100 more. We've survived hull breaches and reactor failures and diseases that evolved in alien environments our biology wasn't prepared for. We've lost entire colonies to mistakes and accidents and learned from each failure. Calthor stood from his platform and descended to the main floor, which was unusual enough that his officers tensed visibly. He walked to one of the displays and studied the image of human soldiers fighting on an airless moon. "Why are you telling me this human?" he asked. "Do you think your history of violence will impress me? The Vraxian Empire has conquered species with far longer military traditions than yours. We have faced warriors who trained from birth to fight, and we defeated them all." Sarah met his gaze, and her expression was calm. "I'm not trying to impress you, General. I'm trying to educate you. You issued an ultimatum demanding humanity's surrender, but you don't understand what you're asking. You think we're like the other species you've conquered, but we're not. All species are the same when faced with superior force," Calthor stated. "That's where you're wrong," Sarah replied. "The species you conquered had someone else to fight. They had natural predators or rival civilizations or external threats that taught them when to submit for survival. Humanity has only ever had itself. We've never learned how to surrender because we've never had anyone to surrender to. Every war we've ever fought has been total because both sides were human and both sides knew the other would never stop." The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of the display systems. Sarah changed the image one final time to show a graph of human population growth and industrial capacity over the past 2 centuries. The curve was exponential and showed no signs of slowing. "You have 1 cycle to demand our surrender," she said quietly. "But I don't think you've considered what happens if we refuse. You haven't calculated the cost of actually conquering a species that doesn't know how to quit. You haven't thought about what it means to occupy worlds full of people who would rather die fighting than live on their knees." Calthor turned away from the display and his 4 eyes studied Sarah with an intensity that would have made most beings uncomfortable. "You're bluffing," he said. "You're trying to make me believe your species is too dangerous to conquer, but I can see your ships and I know your weapons. You cannot stand against the Vraxian fleet." "You're absolutely right," Sarah agreed, and her easy admission clearly surprised him. "In a direct military confrontation, we would lose. Your technology is superior, and your forces outnumber ours by a significant margin. If this were a conventional war between 2 galactic powers, you would crush us. Then, why are you wasting my time with this presentation?" Calthor demanded. Sarah smiled, and it was the same unpleasant expression she had worn when they first met. "Because, General, this won't be a conventional war. It will be an occupation, and that's something entirely different. Your ultimatum doesn't just demand that we lose a battle. It demands that we accept permanent subjugation. It demands that billions of humans accept alien rule over their lives and their children's lives and every generation that follows. Do you really think we'll do that peacefully?" For the second time since meeting this human, Calthor felt the cold touch of doubt. General Calthor had conquered 17 species over his long military career, and he knew how to break an enemy's will to fight. The human Commander Chun had presented her history lesson with admirable confidence, but ultimately, it changed nothing. Words and past glories meant nothing against present reality, and the reality was that the Vraxian fleet possessed overwhelming force. "Your presentation was informative," Calthor said, as he stood in his command center aboard the flagship. Sarah Chun stood beside him at his invitation because he wanted her to witness what came next. But it does not change the fundamental equation. Your species has fought itself for all its history, and now you will face an enemy you cannot defeat through stubbornness alone. What are you planning, General? Sarah asked, though her calm tone suggested she already suspected the answer. A demonstration. Calthor gestured to the tactical display that showed the human colonies in this system. You claim your people will never surrender and will make occupation impossible. I intend to prove otherwise by showing what resistance costs. We will assault one of your smaller settlements, and your people will see that defiance leads only to death. Sarah's expression didn't change, But Calther saw her hands clench briefly before relaxing. "Which colony?" "The mining settlement you call Titan's Rest." Calther indicated a small marker on the display. "Our intelligence shows it has a population of approximately 8,000 with minimal defensive installations. They will be given one opportunity to surrender, and if they refuse, we will take the colony by force. You will watch, and then you will explain to your superiors what happens when humans choose pride over survival." "I see," Sarah said quietly. "And you believe this will convince humanity to surrender?" "I believe it will convince your leaders that protecting their people requires accepting reality," Calther replied. "We do not wish to exterminate your species, Commander. We merely require obedience. The choice belongs to humanity." 6 hours later, the Vraxian assault fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Titan's Rest. The colony was built into and around several large asteroids that had been captured and moved into stable orbits. Mining equipment and habitat modules created a sprawling complex that represented years of human effort and investment. Calther broadcast his ultimatum directly to the colony's administration. "Attention, Titan's Rest. You are ordered to surrender immediately and accept Vraxian authority. You have 1 standard hour to comply. Any resistance will be met with overwhelming force. This is your only warning." The response came from a woman whose weathered face filled the communication screen. She looked to be in her 60s with the kind of scars and calluses that came from years of hard physical labor. "This is Director Yuki Tanaka of Titan's Rest," she said, and her voice carried an accent that Sarah recognized as Mars Colony. "We've received your ultimatum, General, and we have a response for you." Calther waited, expecting the inevitable plea for mercy, a request for more time to evacuate. "Our response is go to hell," Director Tanaka said calmly. Titan's Rest does not surrender. The communication cut off before Calther could reply. Sarah watched his reaction carefully and saw the flash of anger in his 4 eyes. This was not how conquered species behaved. They were supposed to understand the futility of resistance and accept the mercy he offered. "Very well," Calther said coldly. "Launch the assault. All personnel are to be taken alive if possible, but resistance is to be crushed immediately. I want this over within 2 hours." The Vraxian assault forces deployed with practiced efficiency. 300 shock troops in heavy armor accelerated toward the colony in armored transports, while support ships took position to provide covering fire. It should have been a simple operation against a lightly defended mining settlement. What happened next would be studied in Vraxian military academies for generations to come, as an example of how assumptions could kill. The first transport approached one of the larger asteroids and prepared to dock at what appeared to be a cargo airlock. The lock opened on schedule, and the first squad of Vraxian soldiers pushed inside, weapons ready for any defenders. The cargo bay beyond was empty, except for several large, cylindrical containers that the tactical assessment identified as standard mining equipment storage. The squad leader signaled all clear, and the rest of his unit began to file in. Then someone remotely activated the mining charges stored in those containers. The explosion vaporized the first transport and killed every soldier in the boarding party. Debris from the blast damaged 2 other transports and forced the assault wave to scatter. "Mining charges," Sarah said softly as she watched the tactical display update. "Titan's Rest is a mining colony, General. They have access to explosives designed to crack asteroids. Those charges are vastly more powerful than military demolitions." Calther said nothing, but his clawed hands gripped the edge of the command console. The second wave of assault forces approached more cautiously and used long-range scanners to detect explosives before attempting to breach the colony. They found airlocks that weren't trapped and began cutting through with plasma torches. The defenders of Titan's Rest met them with weapons that ranged from improvised to inspired. Industrial cutting lasers became sniper weapons. Pressurized gas cylinders became fragmentation grenades. The colonists turned their mining suits into combat armor and their excavation equipment into weapons platforms. Sarah watched as a Raxian squad advanced down a corridor, only to have the gravity plating suddenly reverse. The soldiers tumbled upward and smashed into the ceiling where magnetic mines had been hastily attached. Another squad found themselves fighting in complete darkness as the colonists cut power to entire sections and used thermal imaging equipment they normally employed for surveying hot asteroids. Your people are using civilian equipment as weapons, Calther observed, and there was something in his voice that Sarah couldn't quite identify. This is not military resistance. These are ordinary workers. These are humans, Sarah corrected. Director Tanaka is a 63-year-old grandmother who's been mining asteroids since before I was born. The man who just took out your assault team with that industrial drill is probably a retired engineer. The woman running their tactical coordination used to design habitat life support systems. They're civilians, General, but they're also the descendants of the species I showed you earlier. The ones who nearly destroyed themselves rather than surrender to each other. The battle for Titan's Rest lasted 8 hours instead of the projected 2. The Vraxian forces eventually won because they had superior numbers and technology, but the cost was catastrophic by their standards. 40% casualties among the assault troops and complete destruction of 3 transports. The colony itself was so heavily damaged by the fighting that it would take months to restore basic function. Worst of all, from Calther's perspective, was that the humans had refused every opportunity to surrender. When cornered, they fought harder. When offered mercy, they rejected it. Even when the outcome was clearly hopeless, they continued to resist. Vraxian medics found wounded colonists who had booby-trapped their own positions, hoping to take enemies with them when medical aid arrived. Director Tanaka was captured in the final assault on the colony's command center. She had been coordinating the defense until the last moment and had destroyed all useful intelligence data before the Vraxians breached her position. When they brought her to the flagship in restraints, she looked directly at General Calther with defiant eyes. 8,000 civilians, she said. You brought your entire assault fleet against 8,000 miners and their families, and we held you off for 8 hours. How long do you think 40 billion humans can hold out, General? How many of your soldiers do you think you'll lose taking Earth or Mars or the Belt colonies? Calther dismissed her to the detention cells, but her words echoed in his mind. Sarah Chun stood silently at her observation post and watched the shattered remains of Titan's Rest drift in the darkness of space. She had not enjoyed watching her people die, but she understood why Director Tanaka had made the choice she did. Your demonstration proved something, General, Sarah said quietly. But I don't think it proved what you intended. FIFA turned to look at her, and for the first time since arriving in human space, he felt uncertain about the path he had chosen. Calculate the cost, Sarah continued. You used 300 elite shock troops to take one small mining colony and lost more than 100 of them. You destroyed transports and equipment that cannot be easily replaced this far from your supply lines. And you accomplished what exactly? You captured damaged facilities and prisoners who will resist your authority every moment of every day. She met his four-eyed gaze with steady determination. That was just 8,000 humans, General, Sarah said. Most of them elderly or middle-aged workers. None of them were trained soldiers. Now multiply that resistance by 5 million, and you begin to understand what conquering humanity actually means. The aftermath of Titan's Rest hung over the negotiations like a shadow. General Calther had achieved his tactical objective, but the strategic picture had become far more complicated than he had anticipated. His officers now looked at human space with calculation rather than contempt, and that shift in perspective troubled him more than he wanted to admit. Sarah Chen requested another formal meeting, and this time Calther granted it immediately. She entered the negotiation chamber without ceremony and placed a data chip on the table between them. "I have a counteroffer, General," she said without preamble. "The conquered do not make offers," Calther replied, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Then it's fortunate we haven't been conquered yet." Sarah activated the data chip, and the chamber's displays lit up with information that made every Raxian officer in the room stiffen. "While you've been demonstrating your military superiority, we've been gathering intelligence on your fleet and your empire. The results are illuminating." The first display showed detailed schematics of Raxian ship design. Not the rough approximations that human sensors might have captured, but precise technical specifications that could only have come from inside knowledge. "How did you obtain this?" Calther demanded. "Your assault on Titan's Rest lasted 8 hours, General," Sarah replied calmly. "During that time, our intelligence services accessed your tactical network through the communications equipment in your boarding craft. Your encryption is excellent, but not perfect, and we're very motivated learners. We've been reverse engineering your technology from the moment your fleet arrived." She changed the display to show a timeline of human industrial capacity. "Our scientists have already identified 3 key technologies we can reproduce with our existing infrastructure: shield harmonics, drive systems, and weapons targeting matrices. We won't match your capabilities immediately, but we will match them. The question is how long that takes and how many of your ships we destroy while we're learning." Calther's primary officer, Sub-Commander Vrix, spoke up for the first time. "This is bluster. Even if you obtained our technical data, you lack the industrial base to produce these systems at scale." Sarah smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Let me tell you about human industrial capacity, Sub-Commander. During our Second World War, we went from building a few dozen aircraft per month to building thousands. We converted civilian factories to military production in weeks and trained workers to operate complex machinery in days. That was with primitive 20th century technology." The display now showed the sprawling orbital factories around Earth and Mars and the Belt. "We currently have 43 major shipyards in operation with another 60 under construction. Each yard can produce a Corvette-class vessel every 2 months or a destroyer every 6 months. If we switch to total war production and stop worrying about quality control or crew safety, we can triple that output." "Quantity cannot overcome quality," Calther stated. "You're right," Sarah agreed. "In a conventional war, your superior technology would allow you to destroy 3 or 4 of our ships for every one you lose. But General, this won't be a conventional war, and you won't be fighting our fleet. You'll be fighting our entire civilization." She pulled up new data showing human colony distribution throughout their sphere of influence. "We have 40 established colonies and another 100 outposts in various stages of development. Each colony has between 5,000 and 5 million inhabitants. Each one has industrial capacity and defensive installations, and most importantly, each one has people who will resist occupation." Sarah walked around the table until she stood directly in front of Calther. "Let me paint you a picture of what conquering humanity actually looks like. You defeat our fleet in a series of battles that cost you perhaps 20% of your forces, acceptable losses for a conquest. Then you begin landing troops on our worlds, and that's when the real war begins. We know how to occupy conquered territory," Calther said. "Do you?" Sarah challenged, "because Titan's Rest suggests otherwise. That was one small mining colony, General, and it cost you 40% casualties among your assault troops. Now imagine that on a planetary scale. Imagine trying to hold Earth with its 9 billion inhabitants or Mars with its 3 billion. How many soldiers will you need? How much equipment? How long can you maintain supply lines across light years of hostile space?" The displays changed to show economic projections and casualty estimates. "Our analysts have run the numbers. If humanity fights the way we fought at Titan's Rest, and we will then occupying our major colonies, will require a minimum of 500 million Vraxian troops in garrison duties alone. That's before accounting for combat losses. During the actual conquest, which our models predict, at 30 to 40% of your invasion force, Rick stepped forward and studied the projections with clear skepticism. These numbers assume resistance at an unsustainable level. No population can maintain continuous armed opposition for the years it would take to fully pacify your worlds. You're thinking like a rational military strategist, Sarah said. That's your mistake. Humans aren't rational when it comes to freedom. We fought civil wars that lasted decades over questions of governance and human rights. We've maintained resistance movements for generations against occupying powers. We don't calculate odds and make logical decisions about when to surrender. We fight until we win or die, and then our children continue fighting. Calther had been silent during this exchange, but now he spoke quietly. You're describing mutual destruction. If we commit to conquering humanity at any cost, we will eventually succeed. We have the population and resources to replace our losses. Do you? Probably not, Sarah admitted. If you're willing to spend 50 years and billions of lives, you can probably break human resistance through sheer attrition. But General, that's not the calculation you should be making. She activated a new display that showed a star map of Raxian space. Your empire spans 300 light-years and incorporates 17 conquered species. Those conquests were achieved because the species you faced understood. When they were beaten and accepted occupation as preferable to extinction. They're culturally accustomed to hierarchy and submission to superior force. That's not an insult. It's an observation about how their societies function. The star map now highlighted specific systems within Vraxian territory. But what happens when those 17 species watch you struggle to conquer a primitive species like humanity? What happens when they see your fleet tied down in human space for years, bleeding resources and personnel? What happens when they realize that resistance is possible if you're willing to pay the price? Calthers is a narrowed. You're suggesting our conquests would rebel. I'm stating a certainty, Sarah replied. We've been in contact with 3 of your subject species through intermediaries. They're very interested in how this conflict resolves. If humanity forces you to withdraw, or even if we just make conquest too expensive to complete, they will see weakness. Your empire is built on the perception of invincibility, General. And we're in the process of shattering that perception. She pulled up communications, intercepts, and intelligence reports that showed. Her claim was not empty boasting. The Kalani species in the Vraxian border regions had already begun stockpiling weapons. The Thurvian resistance movement that Calther thought had been crushed 10 years ago was recruiting again. This is your counteroffer, then? Calther asked. Threaten me with empire-wide rebellion if I don't withdraw from human space? No, Sarah said. My counteroffer is much simpler. You withdraw your fleet and declare that humanity has been evaluated and found unsuitable for integration into the Vraxian Empire. You tell your superiors that our primitive technology and savage nature make us more trouble than we're worth. You save face and we avoid a war neither of us can afford. And if I refuse? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Then we fight, and we make you regret ever coming to human space. We won't win, General, but we'll make sure you don't either. Every ship you lose will take years to replace this far from your industrial centers. Every soldier who dies occupying our worlds is one less defender for your empire's borders. Every resource you pour into conquering us is one you can't use to maintain your existing conquests. She leaned forward slightly. You spent your career conquering species that knew how to surrender. Now you're facing one that doesn't. The question you need to ask yourself is whether the prize is worth the cost. Is adding humanity to your empire worth destabilizing everything you've already built? The negotiation chamber fell silent as Calther considered her words. Around him, his officers waited for his response, and Sarah stood calmly as if the fate of 2 civilizations didn't rest on this moment? Finally, Calther spoke. I need time to consider your proposal. You have until your ultimatum expires, Sarah replied. After that, the shooting starts and neither of us will be able to stop what comes next. The final hours before the ultimatum expired moved with agonizing slowness. General Calther sat alone in his private quarters aboard the flagship and reviewed everything that had transpired since the said Raxian fleet arrived in human space. The tactical reports from Titan's Rest lay open on his desk alongside Sarah, Chen's intelligence data, and the casualty projections for a full-scale invasion. The numbers were undeniable. Conquering humanity would be possible, but the cost would be extraordinary. More than that, the strategic implications of tying up his fleet for years in this remote corner of the galaxy could indeed destabilize the Empire's other holdings. Sarah Chun had not been bluffing about the subject species watching this conflict with interest. A chime announced a visitor, and Sub-Commander Vrix entered when granted permission. The officer's bearing was stiff and formal in a way that suggested he had something unpleasant to report. General, I must speak plainly, Vrix began. The officer corps has been analyzing the situation and we have concerns about proceeding with the invasion. Calther gestured for him to continue. The humans fight differently than any species we have encountered, Vrix said carefully. They do not seem to calculate survival odds before committing to action. Our battle algorithms cannot predict their tactical decisions because they frequently choose options that maximize enemy casualties, even at the cost of their own lives. They're irrational. Calther suggested. No, General, Vrix corrected. They're playing a different game than we are. We fight to achieve objectives with acceptable losses. They fight to make victory Pyrrhic. They understand they cannot defeat us militarily, so instead they aim to make conquest worthless. It's a sophisticated strategy disguised as primitive aggression. Calther stood and walked to the viewport that showed the distant blue-green sphere of Earth. What do you recommend, Sub-Commander? Withdrawal, Rick said bluntly. We declare humanity unsuitable for integration and relocate our forces to regions where they can be used more productively. The Empire gains nothing from this conquest that justifies the projected costs. The High Command ordered me to bring humanity into the Empire, Calther reminded him. The High Command ordered you to evaluate humanity for integration, Vrix countered. Your evaluation can conclude that integration is strategically inadvisable. You have the authority to make that determination. Calther considered this and recognized the political cover his sub-commander was offering. He could withdraw without it appearing as a defeat if he framed the decision correctly. But doing so would mean accepting that a primitive species had successfully defied the Vraxian Empire, and that precedent troubled him deeply. A communication alert interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Chun was requesting a final meeting before the ultimatum expired. Calther granted the request and made his way to the negotiation chamber one last time. Sarah entered looking composed despite the enormous pressure she must have been under. She carried no data chips or presentation materials this time, just herself and whatever final argument she had prepared. General Calther, she began formally, I want to thank you for hearing me out over these past days. I know my people have not made this easy for you. That is an understatement, Commander, Calther replied. Sarah smiled slightly. I'm going to be direct because we don't have much time left. You came here expecting to add humanity to your empire the way you've added 17 other species. You thought we would recognize superior force and submit because that's the rational choice. But you've learned something about us during your time here. I've learned you're willing to die rather than surrender, Calther said. That's part of it, Sarah agreed. But it's deeper than simple stubbornness. You see, general humanity has never had a place in someone else's hierarchy. Every government we've ever known was one we created ourselves. Every law we followed was one we wrote. Every leader who ruled us was one we chose or fought to overthrow. The concept of accepting permanent subjugation to an external power is literally outside our cultural framework. She walked to the viewport and looked out at the Vraxian fleet. Other species you've conquered had experience with being conquered. They had been invaded before or had myths about superior beings who ruled from above. They could fit Vraxian occupation into their existing worldview. We can't. Kelthor joined her at the viewport. Are you saying this is inevitable? That humanity and the Vraxian Empire cannot coexist? I'm saying we cannot coexist with you ruling us, Sarah clarified. But there are other forms of coexistence. Trade agreements, diplomatic relations, mutual defense pacts. The galaxy is large enough for both our species if we're willing to treat each other as equals. The Empire does not recognize primitive species as equals, Kelthor stated. Then perhaps the Empire needs to reconsider its policies, Sarah replied, because General, the galaxy is changing. Humanity won't be the last species you encounter that refuses traditional conquest. Sooner or later, you'll meet others who react the way we have, and if you haven't adapted your approach, you'll face this same calculation again. The communication system chimed with an alert. The deadline for the ultimatum was now 30 minutes away. Soon Kelthor would have to make his decision and commit to a course of action. You asked me earlier what I recommend, Sarah said quietly. Here it is. Take your fleet and leave human space. Tell your high command that humanity is too primitive and too fractious to be worth integrating. Tell them we're useful as a buffer state or trading partner, but that conquest would be counterproductive. You can frame it as a strategic decision rather than a defeat, and humanity will accept this? Kelthor asked. We'll celebrate it, Sarah assured him. You'll be the general who saved humanity from invasion, and we'll make sure that story spreads. Your reputation remains intact, and your empire avoids a costly war. Everyone wins. Kelthor turned away from the viewport and faced her directly. All four of his eyes focused on this human who had somehow managed to outmaneuver him despite commanding no ships and controlling no armies. She had won this confrontation through pure force of will and strategic thinking. You were very confident from the beginning that I would choose withdrawal, he observed. Even when I demonstrated our military superiority at Titan's Rest, you never wavered. Why? Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Because I understood something about you, General. You didn't become the conqueror of 17 worlds by being reckless or stupid. You achieved that title by being smart and calculating and knowing when to fight and when to find another path. I bet everything on you being rational enough to see that conquering humanity isn't worth the cost. And if you had been wrong about me, then humanity would have fought and died and made you regret your decision for the rest of your life, Sarah said simply. But I wasn't wrong, was I? The deadline alarm sounded throughout the flagship, indicating that the ultimatum had reached its final moments. Kelthor had to make his choice now. He activated the fleet-wide communication system, and every ship in the Vraxian force received his transmissions simultaneously. All vessels, this is General Kelthor. After thorough evaluation of the human species, I have determined that they are unsuitable for integration into the Vraxian Empire at this time. Their primitive technology and fragmented political structure would require disproportionate resources to manage. Furthermore, their aggressive nature and lack of respect for hierarchy make them poor candidates for productive citizenship. Sarah listened to his words and kept her expression neutral, even as relief flooded through her. Therefore, Kelthor continued, I am ordering immediate withdrawal from human space. We will maintain monitoring stations at the periphery of their territory and reassess the situation in 50 standard cycles. This decision is final and represents my professional military judgment as fleet commander. Kelthor out. The communication ended and silence filled the negotiation chamber. Sarah and Kelthor stood facing each other, and both understood that something significant had just occurred. Thank you, General, Sarah said quietly. Kelthar raised one clawed hand to stop her. "Do not thank me, Commander. I did not do this for humanity's benefit. I did it because you convinced me that conquest would damage the Empire. That is the only calculation that matters." "I understand," Sarah replied. "Do you?" Kelthar stepped closer, and his four eyes studied her intently. "Because I want to make something very clear. This is not friendship or alliance. This is a strategic withdrawal based on current circumstances. If humanity develops into a threat to the Empire, or if our strategic situation changes, we will return. And next time, we will not offer the option of surrender." "Noted," Sarah said calmly. Kelthar turned to leave, but paused at the chamber entrance. "You said earlier that one of us would kneel before this was over. You were right, but perhaps not in the way either of us expected." Sarah tilted her head questioningly. "I'm not kneeling to humanity," Kelthar explained. "I'm acknowledging reality. Sometimes the wisest choice is to walk away from a battle you can win, but cannot afford to fight. That is not defeat, Commander. That is wisdom."